After Stephen Stayner and Timothy White escaped their captor, they each went back to living the lives they had before being kidnapped. But Stephen Stayner had been missing for 7 years, and going back to his old life, as it was before, was impossible. And in the middle of discovering his place with the Stayner family, intrusions from the outside world would continually get in the way. As a victim and a witness, police needed Stephen's help building a case against Kenneth Parnell, and the press would continue to look for information into the case and the lives of each boy. This episode, we continue to cover the experiences of Stephen and Timothy after their escape in Part 8 of our series on the life and kidnapping of Stephen Stayner, A New Normal, Part 2. Thank you for joining us for this episode of California True Crime. With me are Sean and Charles. How you guys doing?
I'm great.
I'm excellent.
All of the episodes in this series are continuations of the story, but this episode in particular is really it's part 2 of the last episode. We kind of ran out of time, so we had a lot of good discussions, and we're just going to go back into it. All of the information for this episode came mainly from newspaper articles. The press is still deep into the story, so I use many sources, but in particular the Ukiah Daily Journal, the Merced Sun-Star, and the Press Democrat. Last episode, we talked about some of the things happening in Ukiah in the weeks after the boys' escape. And just a reminder, at the same time all of those things are happening, and all the stuff that we're going to talk about in this episode, there are things going on in the trial of Parnell, the beginnings of things, and courts and preliminary hearings, but we're going to cover that in a separate episode, so not to confuse people.
So just to put it back in our timeline, what we're talking about tonight is happening within the first few weeks after Stephen and Timothy come home.
Right.
And Parnell's original trial happens, are we talking like months later, or is this, they will commence in a year, or?
He actually has 2 trials, one for each of the kidnapping charges, so one in Ukiah and one in Merced. Well, in theory, they get moved, but that's, there's 2 separate trials. They start the first one about a year later, but all of the legal stuff starts right away with preliminary hearings. He first gets arraigned and then preliminary hearings, and all of that happens really quickly. And the boys have to be there, Stephen in particular, for both. He's testifying both as a witness and as well as his own kidnap trial. So there's tons of legal stuff happening even in the first few weeks.
So Stephen rescues Timothy, they arrest Parnell, and everything, it just moves right along.
Right, because Parnell has a right to a
speedy trial.
Right, so things happen quickly. So not only are things happening in the Ukiah case, as we talked about, the Merced police are also very busy. There's some question initially about who will be able to bring charges in the case against Parnell on behalf of Stephen Stayner. We will go into detail on that question next episode because it's really interesting. But for this episode, the important thing is that Merced police, from the moment Stephen is found, know that they might have a difficult time bringing charges against Parnell. And they work very hard to kind of cross their T's and dot their I's, to do everything right, and they keep a lot of information to themselves. Last episode, we talked about the Merced police keeping Stephen, for instance, from answering certain questions during the press conference. The Ukiah police, they found Timothy, they've arrested someone. That's sort of an open and shut case. For the Merced police, it's been 7 years. So there's a lot of things they have to do to make sure that case is solid. They are very interested in making sure there's some justice served. And despite what the law will allow, and later, I think if people know this case, what they've probably heard about is the sentencing that happens and the low number of years that Parnell gets. But it does seem that the police are doing everything in their power to be able to bring as many charges as they can against Parnell.
Has there been a case that the police have had to try to put together evidence to prosecute, like the kidnapping of Stephen Stayner before?
I don't know statewide. I'm not really sure. I don't know my kidnapping history that well, but what I can say is that I don't think it's happened in the 2 places that we're talking about, Ukiah and Merced. And they all seem very surprised and sort of taken aback by the situation in this case, that someone kidnapped, and even the law doesn't actually cover this. The law kind of focuses on kidnapping for ransom or for murder. And so that's not the case here, and I think that's what they're trained for.
Well, it seems like we've talked a lot about this in all of these episodes where Stephen's story is so unique for so many reasons, and this is another example of that the police and then the prosecutors are trying to put together a case that they've never seen, and there's no path to follow.
Right. And I think it's also important to remember that even if there is another case where this happened, that knowledge really kind of might just stay with the police there. It takes a lot. We've heard of several cases, and we'll talk about a little bit about how this one changes sort of larger institutions, but police are very local. So what Ukiah police or what Merced police, they don't have as many avenues for, I don't know,
Sharing information,
but also getting trained on new things. It's all about money as well as perhaps the LA police they have a huge infrastructure.
Not only do they have a larger pool of people to pull from, but more money to get more training. There's more crime, which maybe there's a need. Maybe even from the outside, seeing, well, why would a city like Merced need specialized training on X, Y, or Z?
Right. And if you couple that with the fact that society at large is just starting to understand sexual abuse and physical abuse and is yet to really be trained on those things, and we don't even really have institutions for taking kids out of the home and things like that quite yet. That's just happening. I think this is not a case where people had right away all of the information they needed at their fingertips.
And after 7 years, they might not have thought that he was actually alive. There might have been no percentage where they thought he was alive. So they're just like, okay, it's filed away. Let's start forgetting about it. And then so they have to redo it all.
Or go along the avenue of, if and when we ever find him, he'll be dead. And then we'll prosecute this like a murder that we know. And again, nothing against either Merced or Ukiah, but every police department should have training in the areas and be able to have these resources. But like you said, nobody's been prepared for it.
Yeah, and keeping the information to themselves, like they said, that could just be we don't know what's going on. We need to gather some information.
And again, we make a point of this. You talking to us about the case and researching it and reading it for ourselves, I lose track sometimes that we are talking about 1980. There's not a way for departments, not an efficient way for a lot of places in California to share information about tactics or resources, or hey, we have this information or we have this expert in our, you have to pick up a phone call and then to me it seems like you have to kind of know somebody.
Right, or fax a picture like we heard about.
Right. I do think that the Merced police, they have been, all the tips that they got, they did look into over the years. So I don't know what their thinking is exactly, but we do know that even after just 16 days, Ukiah police kind of thought to themselves that they might be looking for a body in Timothy's case. And this is 7 years, so that's a lot longer. The other thing is that we also know when Stephen goes missing, at least one person writes a letter in about the man at the restaurant who keeps the company of boys. So I think that's a motive that they've already considered, at least when he goes missing in 1972, whether it's at the top of their minds at the moment or not. As well as Parnell's history comes out pretty quickly in the paper. But I will say later, when we talk about sort of wrap up what happens to everybody, when Parnell gets out of jail, he tries to buy a child. And that's in the early 2000s, I believe. And in the articles I read, there was a police officer who said that they didn't really think that kind of thing happened in the United States. So even though it's sort of something we've come to know exists, and it's awful, but we understand that trafficking exists in America, I don't know how long it takes for a lot of everyday police to get there. But helping police with all of this is Stephen Stayner. He has a pretty incredible memory of the places that he went with Parnell, people they knew or came into contact with, and as you can imagine, this is really helpful for police. And we've mentioned it before, but a lot of the information they get about Parnell and other attempted kidnappings or the roles of other people comes directly from Stephen. The one thing he continues not to talk about is the sexual abuse he suffered. Police are asking him these questions directly. The motive given for these crimes in the newspaper is that Parnell wanted a family, and Stephen will tell police that Parnell was getting older and needed more help. And this is a motive that even after the trials will still be something that's printed in newspapers here and there. Not everywhere, but for the most part, it sticks around. But Merced police are a little more onto this trail. I think they're not so focused on him wanting a family. They're being quieter, but they seem more focused on
the sexual abuse.
Right. And I mean, that may be also because these are the people who will be bringing ultimately charges, not Ukiah.
Do you think that has something to do with the letter from early when Stephen goes missing, claiming that a person who has been seen in the company of boys kidnapped Stephen, or could have kidnapped Stephen?
I mean, it could have been among the thinking, like we said in the early days. I don't know. I know Parnell's history comes out really quickly, and I think once you read that, it's hard to look away from what might actually be happening. But they seem from that first press conference where they keep Stephen from answering certain questions, that they are on a trail to find out more information. Eventually, in late March 1980, he will begin to talk to police about the abuse. I can't tell you exactly when that happens or in how much detail he goes into. That information is not shared with the public. But on March 25th, 1980, just a few weeks after he was found, the Merced District Attorney will add molestation charges to the things Parnell is being charged with. They do this quietly. It's public, so the press and people find out about it, but they don't hold a press conference. It's not turned into a big spectacle. At the same time all of this is happening, the Stayner family are getting to know each other again. And in Stephen's case in particular, he's been found, and it sort of seems like that should be the end of the story, but life is never that simple. All the Stayners are learning to live together again, and so much has happened. They don't really even know each other. 7 years is a long time to be away, and those were formative years for all of the children. The little boy the Stayners lost when, in the words of Stephen's father, Delbert, quote, "the earth swallowed him whole," will never come home. Whoever that little boy would have been or was is in many ways gone. And this is true for all of the members of the family, including the parents. So this is really a learning process for the family, and there aren't groups to really help them through this. Plus, he's also helping police. He's going in daily probably for interviews. At some point, the police will have him talk with a psychologist to help him get information for trial. He's a witness in Timothy's case as well, so they're going back and forth to Ukiah because, especially in Ukiah, that the trial and arraignment and a preliminary hearing starts, and Stephen is expected to testify in that. So they're going back and forth, and because there's so many legal issues, they shut down hearings, so they have to keep going back and forth. So things get put on the calendar, and then...
So this is again, it's an instance of Stephen's life perpetually being rooted in the worst experience imaginable and constantly having to relive it and not really allowing the family to heal and there's no, I can't imagine there's ever a moving on from this, but a way of coping and dealing and I guess moving forward.
Well, and I don't think there's a way around it. I mean, I think we would all agree Parnell needs to be in jail.
No, definitely.
He's both a victim and a witness, so he has to testify to these things. But it's just, I think, important to remember when people are kidnapped that when they're found, it's not the end of the story. It's not just a happy ending and life goes on.
Well,
there's all this other stuff they have to go through.
How many times do we hear that about something like this too? Is until now, I didn't really think a lot about what happened to Stephen after. Oh, he rescued the little boy and came home, and everything was good. You don't think about the constantly interviews, the legal process.
Right, which is disruptive for him, for the entire Stayner family, for the Whites.
Right.
The first week after Stephen escapes, the children take a week off of school, and Kay and Delbert stay home from work. The family isn't in a hurry to enroll him back in school. They want him to go when he's ready, but they don't actually think it'll be very long. He's doing things with his siblings. For instance, he goes ice skating with his sisters. Just normal sibling stuff, getting to know them again. And the press is still calling and wanting information, and there are stories most days in the paper about Parnell. Stephen rarely over the years will refuse an interview. In an interview later in life, he will say it was his hope that someone out in the world who might be experiencing what he had might see him and come forward. At home, he's also getting a chance to see all the things he missed. He sees family photos of holidays and trips, events throughout the years. And the lies Parnell told him kind of start to really make him angry. In an interview in 1989, Stephen will say that his feelings of sadness or remorse over turning Parnell in turned to anger after he was home. He, quote, "saw what I had missed out on all those years. Then I felt good about it and proud that I had turned him in." With all the press, Stephen is experiencing something similar to what Timothy is experiencing. He's kind of a celebrity. We saw at the beginning of, I think, 2 episodes ago, when the Stayners had hundreds of people, many of whom they didn't know personally, on their front lawn, waiting for Stephen, hoping just to get a glimpse of him when he's coming home. And people all over the country are reading about this story. And I think it still lasts today. People often talk about their connections in Merced or to the Stayner family or...
Yeah, I think we've all, in all the time that you've been researching, and I know we've kind of all talked to our friends and family and coworkers about what we're working on, you do start to get those stories. Oh, I happen to work with so-and-so who happened to be connected to, or I remember where I was when we heard that he was found.
Right. It's more of a historical event almost. It's so big.
It's also like, I know, I guess from my childhood it was Challenger blowing up, that it's a hallmark marker for I know where I was at that time.
Right. And there are probably a few other reasons why Stephen is looked at more like a celebrity. First, I think because this is, on its face, a good news story. He escapes, he comes home, and that's not very common. Second, all of the interviews he's giving, the press is enormous. And third, Stephen doesn't just escape and come home. He does this while saving someone else. So I don't know that everyone's looking at him completely as a victim or as a kidnap victim, but as a hero. And lastly, how he looks, I think, affects how people look at him. He doesn't look like a 14-year-old, and he doesn't look like a child. He looks almost like an adult. And I think it's easy for people to forget he's just a kid. He's also a good-looking kid, and that gets mentioned in a lot of articles. Timothy is always talking about his muscles, but the papers kind of pick that up and keep talking about it. And there's just all these references to his good looks, his American boy good looks. And this we've talked about this in a couple of stories, people not getting attention for cases because of how they look or how they appear, maybe because of their race or their gender. And he's getting tons of attention. I think this is an example of that because he's good looking, but it also still has a detrimental effect on him because he's getting so much attention and he's trying to get his life back on track.
And also, the scars and the damage that was done to him are not visible.
Right.
I mean, he was sexually assaulted for years, neglected and tortured. But he physically, I think even in some of those newspaper articles and those pictures, it's hard to equate that story with the picture of a smiling, happy kid with his family.
Well, and I think we've kind of talked a lot about his emotional well-being and what he's going through. And, we talked a little about him feeling mad now at Parnell when he felt kind of bad for turning him in. I don't know. I mean, I've never been in this circumstance, but there's something about getting so much positive attention for something so awful that has happened to you, that he's getting that at the same time he's just processing all of this, and that has to be so difficult. The press is also taken to describing Stephen in the other way that they describe him is as quiet or as a loner, and that description is even more persistent maybe than the good looks one. It's in every article I read, and I think it happens in part because they're getting a lot of information from when they interview Stephen, and he's a quiet kid, and you're 14, you're getting interviewed, and they're asking questions, and he doesn't know how to answer them. And also B, the other people that they're interviewing are adults who came in and out of his life or maybe drove him somewhere one time, and they describe him as quiet or a loner.
But as you said, he was involved, at least in some part, in his school, had friends, had a girlfriend.
Yeah, he was on teams, stayed the night with friends, all throughout the time that he was gone. In the 2020 that we've talked about a couple times that just happened this year, his girlfriend actually was interviewed. She was his girlfriend in Mendocino County before he was found. And she talks about, bike riding with him, the friends they hung out with. So that's a different kind of picture than what's in the paper now. And it gets to the point where it's almost, I don't know if they mean to, but it's almost judgy in a way. He's constantly a loner. He's constantly quiet.
Well, and I think I know you've talked about it before, that it's no longer Stephen's story to tell it accurately. It becomes a narrative that somebody else is trying to force in, that this, lone kid who's out, obviously he was a victim of this because he was a loner and off by himself.
Even people that I've talked to about Stephen, that went to high school with him or just knew him some way, they all said, oh yeah, he was quiet, he's a loner. Same exact description.
And I mean, we haven't really talked about what happens when Stephen goes back to school. He eventually drops out because of how much bullying he gets. So I don't know that that's a place where someone would ready to blossom or bloom or be themselves. But a lot of the newspapers, like I said, are interviewing people who don't seem to know him that well, seem to know the person as an acquaintance or from afar, or even an adult. And when I was 14, I certainly wasn't the same with adults as I was when my friends are...
Well, and how we've always brought up, they seem to interview the neighbor who had nothing, seemed like a nice guy. They didn't know him, actually,
Well, and two, we're talking about Stephen at 14 entering in high school after being on every major news outlet in the world and then going back into a public high school setting. I can imagine being gun shy about trying to make a relationship with somebody else.
And it's not just being in every newspaper, it's what was said, just like what we talked about, the pictures in the barn and stuff like that. You have this just hovering over you that is, it maybe not people are thinking about it, but you're thinking about it constantly, thinking if they know about this.
Yeah.
Questioning how people see me, or how are they going to react to that, or am I going to have to relive the story again, and just maybe wanting to, I mean, you can't forget it, but again, dealing with it in your own way.
And all of that's without us saying that it's totally fine to be the kind of person who sits by themselves and reads a book or hikes around and does their own thing.
There's nothing wrong with that at all.
But it still sort of sticks around, and it's, like I said, a lot of articles. Articles start to show up here and there. For me, it seems the only purpose for them is to combat this description. For example, there's an article titled, quote, "Stephen isn't a loner these days, says mom," was in the newspaper on March 16th, 1980. And it really was just an article about Kay Stayner saying that Stephen isn't a loner. She says he's spending time on the phone talking to girls he's met. Sounds like she's stepping over him, you know, like he's that kind of movie thing where you're in the hallway on the phone, you got your feet up, and he's talking to girls and she's stepping over him. And that he met those girls while roller skating. I guess he even goes on a date. So, I mean, these seem like articles whose sole reason is that someone else has noticed that he's become a caricature almost.
Well, the further you get away from Merced, the harder it is to bring into focus the actual person rather than the caricature that Stephen has become. If I'm living in Rhode Island and I'm reading the newspaper, I'm watching the nightly news, all I know of Stephen is a boy who was kidnapped for 7 years comes back, and so I'm not going to necessarily read what's in the Merced paper. And unfortunately, those are the news outlets that are probably trying to cover a little bit more of a correct story, you'd hope.
And by this time, the other thing is most of these articles, because trials are starting, or not really trials, but preliminary hearings are starting, so they're really about Parnell. So it's a story about Parnell and what's happening in the courtroom, and then they happen to also remind you that he kidnapped Stephen Stayner, who's also a loner and spent a lot of time by himself. And it just feels really victim-blamey to me.
Mm-hmm.
The world also continues to swirl for the Stayners. There's a lot for them to figure out. They have this person in their house who they haven't seen for 7 years, who's changed, they've changed, and they're trying to also support their other kids through this emotional difficulty. And they don't know how to do that, which I don't think there's any parents out there who are ready for that. They have plans to they do spend part of their Christmas vacation in Mendocino County so that their son can visit his friends, the people he hung out with. They know he had a life, and they want to be understanding of that.
I can't imagine that. As a parent, you're going to take your son back to almost the scene of his abuse because you want that. I mean, yeah, the Stayners as parents are amazing.
They also, on top of doing that, they have plans to have a big holiday season in general. They're very aware also in the newspaper of their other kids and their needs that they have. They tell the press over the years their other children have had to sacrifice. They've been through so much themselves while they looked for Stephen. They weren't able to have full holidays because it was just too difficult for the family and for the parents. They were missing their son. So they want everything to be very special and to give a lot of attention to all of the kids. In the middle of everything that's happening, the police are also looking for an accomplice that helped Parnell kidnap Stephen. The first time the Stayner family finds out there's someone else that's still out there that kidnapped their son is at a press conference on their front lawn the day after Stephen came home. So they sort of find out with the rest of the world. Again, this is based on information the police have gotten from Stephen. Parnell is arrested but does not talk to police at all. Stephen gives the police a detailed description of how he was taken, and he can also pinpoint where he was at different times. He remembers the cabin in Kathy's Valley and being in Yosemite, and tells police there was a second man helping Parnell by the name of either Murray or Murphy. On March 4th, 1980, just 2 days after escaping 7 years of being kidnapped, the Merced police announced that they're looking for a second man in the kidnapping of Stephen Stayner. They describe him as a man in his late 30s and as someone who does not live in Merced. Based on the information that Stephen gave them, detectives set their sight on workers in Yosemite at the time Stephen was kidnapped. They looked through employee records during 1972 and discovered that there are 2 men with similar names to the one Stephen remembered working there at the time. They go through all of the information and determine that Ervin Edward Murphy fit the description Stephen gave them. Murphy, according to his employment records, was working at the lodge in 1972 and was still working there in 1980. Police give Stephen a lineup of 5 photos of men, and he picks out Murphy without hesitation. On March 5, 1980, just 4 days after Stephen escaped Parnell, police traveled to Yosemite to interview Murphy. After a 1.5-hour interview at 11 p.m., the Merced police arrest Murphy for kidnapping, child stealing, and false imprisonment. Police don't release to the press what Murphy tells them or if he confessed, but they do say he provided a statement. After making the arrest, the police take Murphy to his cabin at 11:45 p.m. In 1980, Murphy was living in employee cabin number 2009 in Yosemite Valley, and police sat with him on his bed and searched through his things. Police are very surprised by Murphy. He is physically very short and small, and also very shy. Not the kind of man they were expecting to find. Murphy was a very similar man in 1980 as he was in 1972. He was 5 feet tall, 128 pounds, wore black horn-rimmed glasses and a khaki jacket. He is now 36 years old. He had worked at the Yosemite Lodge since 1968. Before that, he had worked in Sacramento but did not have a criminal record. While searching his cabin, the police asked Murphy questions. Specifically, police were looking for the pamphlets or tracts that he was handing out the day he kidnapped Stephen Stayner, or any information that might tell police if he was still in contact with Parnell. What they found instead was a man who listened to rockabilly, subscribed to the National Enquirer, and was well liked by the people he worked with. He was also very polite to police, often thanking them.
It's strange that the cops might have thought that he'd still have the tracts that he was handing out that day after 7 years. I just think that's a weird specific thing that they were hoping, but to actually say, do you have this from 7 years ago?
Yeah, to search all his things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how many people, I guess there are those criminals that keep mementos and things from their criming.
Mm-hmm.
Police also asked Murphy questions as they went through his things. They asked questions about where he got his clothes. They seemed particularly interested in that. Most often the answer was a secondhand shop. They also asked Murphy if he was into witchcraft. And I initially found that surprising, but then I remembered it's the 80s, and there's a lot on satanic panic and people thinking witches exist.
The term you used, satanic panic, becomes in the forefront of a lot of people during the 80s. The roots, however, go actually further back, all the way in its kind of modern incarnation back to the 60s. You can get into a whole another discussion of Aleister Crowley and a lot of the Temple of the New Dawn and things like that. But where it takes center stages is in 1965 with Anton Lavey starting the Church of Satan here in California and San Francisco. It becomes really popular as kind of part of the counterculture in California in the 60s and leads into the 70s. What happens, though, is then around that same time, there's a few books that are published that really capture the public's imagination. Because I think for a lot of people, at least from what I've read and what I've studied, the Satanism in the 60s and 70s is almost... it's looked on like the hippies. I mean, it's, they see Anton Lavey, and I'm sure if you're listening to this, you know who I'm talking. He's really tall and bald and has the pencil thin mustache and the goatee and wearing black. But in 1971, a book by William Peter Blatty is published and becomes a best-selling novel called The Exorcist, which in 2 years later, in 1973, the movie's made. And that movie shatters box office records. And one of the things that really sparks people, I think, to kind of connect this with Satanism and then what will lead into the Satanic Panic is the story is about a little girl that's possessed by a demon, and it's quote unquote based on a true story. So people are seeing this story and then seeing these images of these Satanists in California, and they're starting to draw connections that may not necessarily be there. Then what happens is another author by the name of Mark Wernicke, his book Satan's Cellar. Now, he starts to make claims that he was a Satanist at one time, and then he took part in unspeakable activities. He would also say that he wanted to convert to Christianity, and that's how he got saved. Now, he tours around the United States making these claims and then selling his books. All of his claims were proved to be false, but not until the damage was already done. He's making these claims, he's selling these books, and he's whipping people into a fervor that Satanists are out there, they're willing to get you, they're going to steal your kids, anybody that wears black. The same kind of tropes that I think a lot of us grew up with in the 80s. That kind of leads us into 1980. Another book called Michelle Remembers is published. It's also co-written by a Canadian psychiatrist, Lawrence Pasder, and one of his patients that he eventually marries, which is incredibly unethical. But the crux of this book really is about how she herself was, I believe, and I haven't read the book, I've read some reviews of it, and then would eventually, spoiler, it's debunked as being false. But this book isn't debunked for like 20 years later. So she's kidnapped, I believe, and abused and tortured by a satanic cult. And again, they publish this book, and it starts to be used. Not only are they touring around like Wernicke in his book, Satan's Cellar, but their book actually starts to, along with Satan's Cellar, but be used by law enforcement and reputable people to say, like, this is happening in your neighborhood. Look what's going along. Look what's happening just beyond the curtain of what you think is normal. Now, the other thing that we've talked a little bit about in some of our previous cases and some of our other episodes is the idea of repressed memory. We talked in this series about the idea of hypnotism. So what I'm saying is there's all of these weird little threads that are pulling along that are getting people whipped into this fervor, and Satanism is what they're pointed at. And they're using it for the explanation for all kinds of evils. Also, this is around the 1970s. You have a resurgence in Christian fundamentalism. Again, I'm not pointing the finger at all Christians and saying this is the reason why we had the Satanic Panic, but you have a lot of people as a backlash to the counterculture in the 60s and early 70s, during the mid 70s because of the recession, and into the 80s when you have the rise of Reagan Republicans. You have a turning back to kind of fundamentalist Christian views, which again, a lot of these people were looking at anything that does not fit my unique square of what's normal is evil, and the biggest evil that everyone was talking at this time was Satanism. There's also the whole thing with backwards masking in heavy metal music. The first times it comes up in the public knowledge is this, even though, I mean, there's a whole history of that we maybe go into another time. My personal favorite connection from the Satanic Panic in the late 70s, early 80s is Dungeons and Dragons. As an avid Dungeons and Dragons player, I was forbidden from playing because I had family members that would say it's satanic. And this game specifically, along with everything else. Now, on our website, CaliforniaTrueCrime.com, in the episode notes, I've actually linked 2 videos. One is probably most Americans' first view of the Satanic Panic was from a Geraldo Rivera piece on NBC that he actually won an award for. And it's terrible. And it's also terribly frightening because of the wild allegations that are made and the people that are being talked about. The other video that we've linked on the page is also somewhat frightening because it's a educational video on how police departments and DAs can investigate satanic crimes. And it's scary because they have a quote-unquote ex-Satanist that goes through a park and explaining like, oh, we can tell there's witch's black mass because of this spray painting, which obviously looks like it's fresh spray paint on the tree that's out in the middle of a nice park. But that's, this is a symbol of Satan, so there's a witch's black mass. And it all of it has a very religious bent to it. Again, I'm not trying to point fingers at any particular religion, but these kind of, the Geraldo piece, but mainly this police department video. It seemed like it was aimed at middle America and more specifically middle white America, and these areas that may not necessarily come in contact with a lot of other cultures or other religions. So it has a very WASP feel.
What I found really interesting when we were talking about this, and I looked up some of the cases that had to do with satanic panic. And in the 1980s, there was several cases in Kern County in which there was a pedophile ring where they convicted 36 people, believing they were part of some satanic cult. And then 34 of those convictions were overturned later. And then, of course, the McMartin preschool case out of Los Angeles, where that same thing starts to happen and the people there turn out to be innocent. What interested me was because we've talked a lot about different periods in history during these episodes, but in the 1980s, Anita Bryant and people using being gay as a reason why someone is a pedophile and that connection. And now we have those same kinds of people using false ideas about Satan or witches as a reason people are pedophiles. That overlapping of those things.
They're looking at an external force of saying this evil has to be caused by something, and it's caused by, in this case, it's caused by Satan. And Satan is making these people kidnap kids, or they're making people pedophiles, or these rings are going to sacrifice your children.
And in particular, all of the cases that I could find, that were the most famous ones where people were accused of these terrible crimes, had to do with child sex abuse, which I found that sort of interesting based on what we're talking about. And then that gets brought into this, even though, I mean, no one ever accuses Parnell of that, but that's obviously, it's a 1980 and it's on their mind when they're interviewing Murphy.
It seems a lot, again, like people are struggling to rationalize, how could this happen in our communities, or how could this go on underneath our nose? And the fact of the matter is, bad stuff happens. Terrible, horrible things go on daily, but because people aren't willing to, I guess, admit that or confront that, they're looking for constant external sources rather than blaming the person. Parnell is a bad person.
Right.
But also how you brought up, it didn't fit in their box. So obviously it's completely wrong.
Yeah, exactly. My worldview says that people should look like this. They should dress like, and I think if you're listening to this, probably you've had some experience in this, whether it's the way you dress or what you listen to or what, I mean, even, food you eat or something that was different about you, and then having somebody look at you and then judge you for that.
And to me, I mean, I haven't researched these cases in depth, but that seems like another instance of innocent people, like we were talking about, people who are gay being blamed for the acts of pedophiles or the act of someone who commits that crime. In this case, blaming someone, and I don't even think there's evidence these people were Satanists or anything like that, but they're innocent and they're going to jail for hurting kids. It's just this whole messed up thing, and all of these innocent people are suffering, and in the meantime, people like Parnell are hurting children and getting away with it.
Right, and slipping through the cracks, because I don't think people are willing to really focus on the actual crimes.
Yeah.
They're making up fictitious reasons.
We want to focus on all these other reasons these things happen instead of actually deal with the reason they do.
Well, and I think, too, we're talking about the 1980s, so then you have, Richard Ramirez come along, spouting off his own brand of, I am evil and I'm Satan and I'm, and so I think some of those people are saying, no, look, he's saying it. It's not something.
Right.
So it's like the old adage, a broken clock can be right twice a day. Oh, that one person saying that they're evil and Satan's making them do it proves that all of these other cases are right.
Mens rea is the legal principle of criminal intent. It means literally the guilty mind. Join me, Sinead, every fortnight to discuss Ireland and the UK's most heinous crimes and the court cases that followed. Do you want to know more about a kink killing in Dublin in 2012? Or serial killers in Scotland? Whatever your guilty pleasure, you'll find it and all the details with me. Find Mens Rea wherever you get your podcasts.
So going back to Murphy, he's sitting on his bed while the police search, and there are actually pictures of this that appear in the newspaper. Police don't find anything that would suggest he's had any contact with Parnell. In Ukiah, they're still looking for someone as well who helped Parnell kidnap Timothy, and they still haven't caught that person. So in their minds, it could possibly be the same person who helped him kidnap Stephen. However, Merced police are able to discount that pretty quickly. As police continue to search, news spreads throughout Yosemite Valley. And I tried to find the exact number of people who would be employed each year at the Yosemite Valley. There's a lot of hotels and restaurants in this particular place. It's kind of like a little community. but I couldn't find an exact number, so maybe 1,000, maybe 2. Murphy's coworkers describe him as a quiet, shy, and gentle man who worked nights and only got upset when people were loud during the day. He's sleeping during the day because he works nights, so he would get kind of upset when he couldn't do that. He was well thought of by the people who he worked with, and they actually get a group together to meet when they hear what's going on with Murphy. Specifically, they want to decide together how to handle the press requests. What they decided is that they cared about Murphy and wanted to wait until they had more information, and in the meantime, they decided together that they wouldn't talk to the press. And I think this is the first time I saw this in the story where people actually got together and thought, we're going to wait.
Yeah, let's take a break, see what comes about it.
Yeah. What little the press did get about Murphy did not paint him in a negative light. He was a personable guy who often helped people in Yosemite Valley. He would give gifts to those he worked with, and he always had country music with him. He would take weekly trips to Merced on the bus that we talked about in an earlier episode to run errands. He often sat with the same woman on these bus trips. She described him as talkative and nice. This woman, who now works in 1980 in the Yosemite Valley, had only lived 2 blocks from the Stayner family in 1972 when Stephen was taken, and had kids who weren't quite yet school age, but she did help with carpools after the kidnapping, whose sole purpose was to just get the kids there safely. So that's just another connection to Yosemite that we've seen before. Murphy was taken to Merced County Jail. In 1980, Merced County Jail held 158 prisoners in a few different cell blocks. On Monday, March 3rd, 1980, just 2 days before Murphy would be brought to the jail, there had actually been a jailbreak attempt. So when they bring Murphy in, the jail is already just kind of at full alert. They want to be thoughtful also about where they put him, in part because things are still tense because of the jailbreak, but also because this is a very high-profile case. It involves a child, and they want to be able to prosecute Murphy, not have something happen to him in jail. And he's also little, that was mentioned as one of the reasons. When Murphy gets to the jail, he's fingerprinted and booked. He thanks officers at every turn. He's put in cell block 1 and in isolation for security. He's kept apart from other prisoners. He's also given blue coveralls, blue sneakers, and was allowed to smoke and allowed to make 1 phone call, which he declined to do. Police, as we said, did not release any of the information that they got from their interview with Murphy. The only quote in the newspaper from this day from Murphy is that he said, quote, "I'm just glad it's all over. I'm really glad that little kid is safe." On March 6, 1980, Murphy was arraigned and a $5,000 bail was set. Back in Ukiah, things take a big turn on March 11th, 10 days after Stephen and Timothy escaped, and 6 days after Murphy was caught. The police announced they've arrested someone as an accomplice to the kidnap of Timothy White. The police don't release the name of the person they've arrested to the press and say it's because he's a juvenile, but they have arrested Sean Poorman, who we know helped Parnell kidnap Timothy. They also don't say how they came to arrest Poorman. Last we left the police, and last episode, they were pretty focused on the Samoa bar, but they could have had leads that they didn't share, or Poorman could have come forward after hearing, if you remember, they made an appeal to the press that they thought whoever helped him had been kind of tricked into doing so. The police do say that the description Timothy gave under hypnosis helped them lead to Poorman, though they never provide any details as to how that happens. The police don't give the press very much information at all, except that the person they've arrested is cooperating and helping them, and that he's under 18, as we said. Poorman is arraigned in juvenile court. Also, there's a gag order on at this time for police, the district attorney, and the defense of Parnell in Mendocino County, so that's also limiting the flow of information. However, on March 13th, 1980, Randall Sean Poorman's name is printed in the paper, and some transcript of his description of the kidnapping will also be printed.
So where did this come from? Why was Poorman's name added? He's a child.
Yeah, unfortunately in California, there aren't actually rules protecting children from their names having been printed as long as not as long as, but if they've committed a crime and the press isn't printing anything false, they can actually print someone's name. They didn't get this directly from the police, or I don't know who they do, but they say a source, and they don't give up that information. So I'm not sure who gave it to them. And the police do seem like they're trying to protect his identity, in part because he's juvenile, but also because he's helping them. And I believe after his arraignment, he's released to his family at some point. And so I don't think they want the press to show up on his doorstep either.
Mm-hmm.
The newspaper also prints that Poorman's reasoning for helping Parnell was that he was, quote, a homosexual and he was afraid of him, We talked a little bit about this before, but I just want to mention here because it connects up with a lot of stuff we've talked about this episode, as well as stuff we talked about in episode 1. The citizens of Ukiah and surrounding areas begin to feel a sense of relief now that Parnell's accomplice has been caught. There are mixed reactions because the person who helped him was only 14 years old, and what that should mean for things like the trial and eventually punishment. The White family is also struggling with this. Angie White will tell the paper that she understands that he's just a kid, but at the same time, she remembers being 14 years old, and in her mind, she knew what it meant for someone to have a child and what it might mean to take that child away. So she seems like she's really struggling with this concept and understandably quite angry. So investigators now have Murphy in jail. They've also arrested Poorman, and they are kind of working to tie up their loose ends. And one of those big loose ends is Barbara Mathias. In 1980, Mathias is living in Laytonville, California, which is a small town about 49 miles north of Ukiah. In 2010, Laytonville only had about 1,200 people living there. It's still in Mendocino County, which is the county that Parnell and Mathias lived in when they were a couple, and also the county that Parnell and Stephen have kind of moved around in. Laytonville is small, but does have a casino called the Red Fox Casino run by the Caddo tribe, as well as America's longest-running hippie commune that was originally started in North Hollywood. It was called the Hog Farm, and now it's located in Laytonville on 200-plus acres of land, and this farm is now called the Black Oak Ranch. This commune has a pretty amazing history. Hopefully we can do an episode on it. It was started by Wavy Gravy and his wife Bonnie Beecher, who now goes by Jahanara Romney. And they started the commune. They were also involved in Woodstock. They have a kids camp there. The Ben & Jerry's, I believe it's a discontinued flavor. Wavy Gravy was named after him. And just a bunch of awesome stuff, so hopefully we can put that together. Mathias, however, is not as cool as the people living in Laytonville, but police need to talk to her to find out if she has any information on Parnell. At the beginning of March 1980, the investigation is still in its early stages, and it's hard to pin down when police find out about the sexual abuse Stephen endures. As we said, they will add some charges later in March. But the other thing police will learn from Stephen, and I don't know when this exactly happens, is that Barbara Mathias also participated in the abuse he endured with Parnell. And that doesn't come out till about a year later when trial starts. He tells this to a psychologist. So I don't think police know this now when they're looking for Barbara. This is not something he shared with them yet.
So when you say he says, it's Stephen reveals it to the psychologist a year later when they're going to trial.
Right. So police are out looking for her, but I don't think they have all of the information quite yet. And I don't think that comes in March. So just keep that in mind as I talk about what's going to happen next. But there are still reasons they want to talk to her. A witness to sexual abuse can be very powerful for their case, and they've also gotten information from people who knew Mathias and Parnell when they were a couple, that when they lived together, that they had other kids with them. And we know, for instance, Barbara's young son, who was 5 years old at the time, comes to live with them. But they want to kind of narrow down who these children are and what happened to them. Police have also gotten some information that in the towns Parnell had lived in with Stephen, that there were some accusations made against him at the time. So they're just trying to narrow down where he was at all times.
And with the amount that they've moved from places to places, that's got to be kind of a Herculean task as well, right?
Yeah, that's actually a big thing that's happening, is that the Merced police have to travel all over to get this information. And if you can imagine, these are small. I mean, Merced's sort of a small city. But, I mean, they have smaller police forces, and that's a lot of resources to devote to getting all the information they need for this case.
And as you pointed out, trying to track down people that have been the victims of sexual abuse years before and getting them to open up and talk, again, that's got to be a huge task.
Right. And it's not just in Merced and Ukiah. In fact, police receive calls from around the country from police who are working on cases that are similar to Stephen Stayner's case. Merced police receive a call from New York detectives who were working on another famous kidnapping we mentioned before in Manhattan that had occurred less than a year before Stephen escaped, the kidnapping of Anton Pates. Pates had gone missing on May 25th, 1979, and the circumstances were really similar. He was on his way to the school bus, and he disappeared without a trace. And I don't know how seriously they're considering Parnell, but when they get this call from New York and they need to know sort of where Parnell was, just in case he was also in the area at the time.
Well, it kind of makes sense. I mean, you have these open cases, and then you have kind of a weird situation that no one knows. And look how Stephen was found was by helping another kidnap victim 7 years later. So it's not far off to think maybe it was him.
Right. And my understanding is in Manhattan, they don't have very much information on this disappearance at all, just like with Stephen. So I think they're going to check everything that they can. A man named Pedro Hernandez would confess in 2012 to murdering Anton Pates, and in 2017 was sentenced for the crime. But in 1980 is just another reason police are trying to narrow down Parnell's timeline, and no one so far besides Stephen really knows Parnell quite as well as Mathias. In the middle of March, police from Merced go to her home in Laytonville, and they find that she's not there. And police even start to think that it might be possible she skipped town to avoid talking with them. But by March 18th, they're finally able to locate her and interview her. Again, when they interview her, I do not think they have the full details of her abusing Stephen herself. And if they do, they certainly don't release those details to the public. She is not arrested, and one of the first things police do is determine she didn't help Parnell kidnap Timothy White. Mathias also tells police she didn't know Stephen had been kidnapped until she saw the news on the television. She says she believed he was Parnell's son, and that Parnell had documents, like the birth certificate we talked about, that said that Parnell was Dennis's father. She also said that she was told Stephen's mother had died when he was 3 months old. Oh, and I don't know how much of this is actually her telling the truth.
Well, he had the birth certificate. He can tell it. He's probably, what we've known, tells really good lies. So saying that the mother died and with a birth certificate, if someone showed me a birth certificate and you're not thinking that he's kidnapped.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm still getting mixed up with some of the stuff from the story about the person that Mathias is. And I guess that the police, I understand the police don't have that information.
But we do, and I understand what you're saying.
Right. It's hard to separate that, I think. It's Monday morning quarterbacking. She seems 100%. I can see maybe not knowing that Stephen's kidnapped, but
she does try to help Parnell kidnap other kids.
Yeah, that's to let her go from that.
But I guess you can believe that's his son and also help him.
That doesn't excuse.
Well, no, it's not an
excuse. It doesn't excuse that she still tried to help him kidnap other people. And if he's willing to do that, wouldn't you take? Oh, first off, if you're a rational person, you probably wouldn't help somebody else try to kidnap somebody. But would you not then look at the child that's with this person and say,
I don't know. Parnell has seemed to find people he can manipulate and control in this story many times, unfortunately. So she, partially because what we're going to talk about next, really makes me angry in particular, but it's hard to know whether or not she fell for that hook, line, and sinker, or whether that's just something she's telling police because she doesn't want to be caught up.
And again, it is hard to separate those because we know more of the story than the police did at that time.
Right.
So they still don't know about the abuse.
Right.
They're just going on. This is another witness to Parnell's evil that we can use to put Parnell in jail.
Yeah, and I do think that she gives police, information that I don't know that it helps directly for them to add charges. The biggest thing they need is, even though if Stephen is telling them things that happened to him, they need someone who either saw something or witnessed something, so that they can bring charges to an actual courtroom. And so I think, they add those charges after they talk with her, and she does tell them a couple things about their living situation that I think they may have hoped to use in a legal sense.
Yeah, because if you're Barbara Mathias, you're just thankful they're not looking at you. Like,
right.
I am culpable of attempted kidnapping, but I'll give you whatever you want on Parnell.
Yeah, and I don't even know how much she shares with that. I know some of that is stuff Stephen at first shares with them. So
then again,
on this first interview, I don't know. They also interview her 12-year-old son who had lived with her and Parnell. He was 5 at the time. Now he's 12. And I don't have any information on what he gave them, but
there's no evidence or anything's ever brought up that he was abused by Parnell.
There's nothing brought up in the court system, and there's nothing in the newspapers about it. So then on March 20th, 1980, Barbara Mathias does something that will make everyone listening to this very angry. She actually shows up at the Stayner house, out of the blue, uninvited, to visit the family. She also brings her son with her. During the visit, she tells the family that the first time she knew Stephen was kidnapped was when she saw it on the news, and that she wanted to come to Merced as a, quote, friendly gesture, because she wanted the Stayner family to know that Stephen was taken care of, loved, and a good kid. And I don't even know when the last time Stephen saw Barbara Mathias. I think probably about 5 years ago. But this is so frustrating in many ways, obviously, because we know more about Barbara Mathias looking back on this than the Stayner family has information about her. But also, you have your child home after 7 years, and people still keep walking into your house. Yeah. And you just can't still protect your kid.
This could have been a bold move by her to just see if Stephen's saying anything about her.
And also to put the light on, look, I'm a caring. Mm-hmm. I was his mom. I had never heard him. And so to get that story spinning out in newspaper, I mean, they're hungry for anything they can print. And once that narrative gets out there, then she can ride that to maybe cover up some of the evil that she's done.
Yeah, Mathias is quoted in the newspaper as saying, quote, I thought that because I babysat for him, you would want to know he was a good boy all the time. He was always a nice boy, and he called me mother like my own kids did.
Oh, to say that to her, or like, right? It's just like ridiculous.
You're throwing it in this poor woman's face, Kate Stayner, who's done nothing but keep hope alive for her child, finally got her child back, and gets to sort of repair that damage. And now you have Mathias coming in, and it's okay, I was his mom.
Yeah, I was so angry when I first read this. The Stayner family welcomes Mathias and her son into their home, as they had so many people. They served beverages, and Stephen played with a basketball with her son. Kay Stayner did become upset at one point and tell Mathias that, quote, it's been hell the last 7 years, to which Barbara Mathias replied, quote, I know, that's why I wanted to come. I know how it would have felt if it had been my kid. When asked about Mathias, Kay Stayner clarified that she was not a house guest and left shortly after the reunion, although Kay and Barbara exchanged addresses so that they can keep in touch. And just thinking back on, especially on what you said, Sean, I mean, Stephen is just starting to open up to police about some of the abuse he suffered. And here comes into your own house this woman who's hurt you as well. I just can't even imagine what this poor kid was going through.
Because not only was he's a victim all over again. Mm-hmm. In his own home. I mean, he's just putting back that trust in his own. He's reconciling what the lies he told with the reality of his own family.
The press is also, unfortunately, it doesn't really seem intrusive, but they're around for this. There's pictures of Mathias at the house with the Stayner family. They ask her a bunch of questions. She avoids most of them. And the press are still just everywhere. They're digging up details. An example of them trying to find anything they can get their hands on is that the Sacramento Bee actually tracks down the bus that Parnell, Mathias, and Stephen lived in. They find it in a wrecking yard. But, they're trying to find anything they can to write an article about.
You can see that with a lot of cases, though.
Right. That's true.
It's just to keep that story going.
Well, I think also in the news you see if it's one certain subject, then all the other newspapers find a smaller version of it and to keep it going like it's the hype.
To put their own spin on it.
Right. Well, just like a totally different thing. Like if there's a hurricane and then they decide to talk about a breeze, but because the hurricane was so talked about, they're just trying to get, people to read their newspaper.
On April 5th, 1980, everyone in the Stayner family but Carrie Stayner, who has to work, goes to Ukiah so that Stephen can be presented with the reward money that the town and people in the area put together when Timothy White went missing. Over the last month, the people of Ukiah have been pushing for Stephen to receive the reward, including the White family and Timothy's babysitter. It took some time to collect all the money that was pledged, but they actually do, and the Timothy White Reward Committee plans a local event to give Stephen the money. A lot of work goes into planning this event, with a special focus on not telling the press what is happening. The community of Ukiah have been through a lot, and the people there are very grateful for Stephen for helping Timothy, and they want to honor him in a personal and small event. It's not meant to be a big, grand thing with all of the press. The Stayner family and the White family also talk before the day and plan to get together. These are two families who are now connected but don't really know each other. They want to talk and let their sons spend some time together. So after the event, their plan is that they're going to get together, just the two families, no press, nothing like that, just by themselves and get to know each other. And I think that sounds like a really sort of healing idea too.
Yeah, it's such a nice thing to do, to allow both boys and both families, but also the larger Ukiah community to come together in almost a controlled way, away from the outsiders.
Yeah. Unfortunately, things do not go as planned. The day the event is planned for is actually on Saturday, April 5th, but by Wednesday of that week, the press finds out about it, and Ukiah is swarmed by reporters and cameras. There were so many reporters that both families are basically mobbed, and police have to move them around Ukiah. At the event, so many press move in that the people of the town, including Timothy's babysitter, who wanted a chance to thank Stephen herself, are pushed to the far back, and they don't even really get a chance to even be able to see what's happening. Timothy and Stephen and the people giving the check are on a stage, and there's so many press, all the townspeople are pushed to the very, very back. On stage, Timothy gives a check for $15,000 to Stephen. Stephen says a few words, quote, "I want to say thank you for the reward. I don't think it was so heroic. It was just something that should be done, so I did it." On stage, the two of them at least get to spend a little time together. They're sitting next to each other, but there's so much press that Timothy's overwhelmed, and they're yelling questions at both of them.
Which undercuts the whole point of this. The whole point of this was to have the people involved away from the press, to have some kind of, like you said, a healing moment for everyone, and so people could actually genuinely show appreciation for this amazing, heroic act. And it degenerates into yet another time of the press.
This is Ukiah, right?
Yeah.
So it could easily go back to, hey, take a picture of mother hugging Timothy. Like, just how, the police probably knew about this, so that probably meant that
it could have easily started as something innocuous, like, oh, let's let the local newspaper come in and take a nice photo of everyone.
Yeah, and I don't know who actually leaks the information for this. I do see a lot of people in the community, including the police, who are very upset by it. So it's hard to know exactly who did it. But Stephen on stage does do a couple of things, or one in particular that I really found interesting. The press are yelling questions to Timmy, and he's getting a little overwhelmed, and he kind of gets them to stop. And he tells them that he's shy like he is and isn't going to answer questions, which is just, I don't know, another instance of Stephen doing something and helping someone else.
With no thought for himself. He's putting himself in a line of fire and protecting somebody else.
Yeah. The Stayners put the reward money into an education trust Stephen can access when he's older. Stephen, on the other hand, wants to buy a dirt bike.
How do you say no to that? If you're the Stayner parents, do you just no? But I was kidnapped for. Do you use that?
Yeah, it has to be hard, right? But he's just, in so many ways, he's just a kid. There are so many press, and getting around is so difficult that both the White family and the Stayner family have to scrap plans to meet and talk, so they don't actually get to spend any time together. The Stayner family goes back to Merced. Oh, and this bothers me, sorry. This really bothers me because all of the newspapers are covering this event, have pictures of Stephen and Timothy smiling together, and they have positive headlines, but knowing that they weren't actually supposed to be there or be taking pictures, or it changed how I viewed those initial photos.
Again, it's the veneer that's put on for public, John Q. Public somewhere that's reading this that has no knowledge of what Ukiah is like, who has no knowledge of what the people are like or what they've gone through.
Yeah, they didn't happen to mention in their articles that this was supposed to be a private event that they disrupted. Luckily, though, the local papers talk a lot about this, so that's where I got the more accurate information about what was happening at this event. So we will stop here, kind of on a positive note of Stephen getting at least some attention and reward for being a hero. Everything that happened in this episode, as I said, it happens at the same time the trial and legal issues start. So our next episode will be all about that.
The information on tonight's cold case comes from the Charlie Project and the Ukiah Daily Journal. Asha Kramer was a 26-year-old when she disappeared on September 21st, 2015, from the Rollerville Cafe, 2 miles outside Point Arena, California. She was with her boyfriend and a friend at the cafe when she used the restroom and never came back. In 2015, Asha Kramer was described as African American with brown hair and brown eyes. She has a gap between her front teeth, a birthmark under her left breast, and a tattoo of a red triangle on her inner right wrist. She speaks with an Australian accent. On the day she went missing, she was wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt, black skinny jeans, and silver rings on her fingers and no shoes. She was 5 feet 10 inches tall and between 135 and 148 pounds. Prior to her disappearance, Asha Kramer was suffering a mental health crisis. She had been unable to sleep for 4 days and was taken to the hospital for evaluations, but refused one while there. She had not had any mental health issues prior. She did not have her wallet, purse, cell phone, ID, or credit cards when she disappeared. In 2015, Mendocino County sheriffs reported that Asha Kramer's family believes it's possible she may be living under an assumed name. The sheriffs are following up on leads and ask that anyone who has information in the disappearance of Asha Kramer contact them at 707-234-2100.
I'd like to thank you again for listening to California True Crime. Don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media platform at Cali True Crime. You can drop us an email at calitruecrime@gmail.com. We'd like to thank our quality control, Melanie Duncan. This has been a production of Chateau Walnut.